Hello, friends at Houston Mennonite Church. My name is Joanna Harader, and I serve as pastor of Peace Mennonite Church in Lawrence, Kansas. We're a fellow Western District congregation. I bring greetings from the church, and I want to let you all know that we're thinking of you all and praying for you right now with all of the weather-related difficulties that you're facing. I was happy to be able to offer to my friend Marty to preach for you this Sunday. I know that he has been occupied this week, obviously with many other things. And so I get to bring a word to you this morning virtually, which I am privileged and delighted to do. This is the first Sunday of Lent. So in the Christian liturgical year, this is the point at which Jesus has turned his face toward Jerusalem, and we are walking with him towards the cross. At Peace, we're using the narrative lectionary, and we're journeying through Luke's gospel. One of the things that Jesus does a lot on his way to the cross in Luke's gospel is tell parables. And when Marty told me you all were having conversations and trying to learn more about anti-racism, this particular parable from Luke came to mind, from Luke 16. It's often called the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, but I have come to think of it as the parable of the chasm. Right? It's the only parable with a chasm, and in fact, the only chasm in the entirety of the New Testament. And what a chasm it is. It's a chasm that the rich man is able to see over, and he can see the poor beggar Lazarus resting comfortably in Abraham's bosom. And I know the more modern translations say Abraham's side, but I like the King James on this one. He's resting in Abraham's bosom. And the rich man can see, and he can even talk over the chasm. But the one thing he can't do is cross it. And of course, this chasm between heaven and Hades is a physical and I would say imaginative manifestation of the divide that existed on earth between Lazarus and the rich man, right? One of them dressed in very expensive purple fine linen, the other one covered in sores, the one feasting with his friends, using scraps of bread as napkins and throwing them on the floor for the dogs to eat, and the other stuck outside the gate longing for some of those table scraps. The storyteller wants to make it very clear that these two men live in different worlds, even when they are both alive on earth. Now there's another storyteller, bear with me, I'm an English major. There's another storyteller named Catherine Mansfield, and she has this same idea in her short story, The Garden Party. The Sheridans, at least the women of the Sheridan household, they're preparing for their annual garden party, right? It's on a sunny early summer day, and it couldn't have been more perfect, she says, if they had ordered it. And at their large, elegant house on the hill, there are hundreds of roses in the garden and trays full of lilies, 15 different kinds of sandwiches, all with the crusts cut off and swept onto the floor. The chasm in this story is between the Sheridans and the people who live down the hill in the cottages. Now, there's not a physical chasm in Mansfield's story, but there is a broad road that ran between them. And compared to the large, beautiful house on the hill, the cottages below are little mean dwellings. And instead of roses in their gardens, they have cabbages and sick children. And even the smoke, as Mansfield describes it, is poor, little rags and shreds of smoke, so unlike the great silvery plumes that uncurled from the Sheridans' chimneys. Right? And the Sheridans, they seem oblivious to the people who live on the other side of this chasm. Like the rich man, they simply ignore the people outside the gate until death comes. Now, in the garden party, none of the rich people die, but there's a tragic accident that kills Scott, a young father who lives in one of the cottages. Laura Sheridan, one of the daughters, learns of this death as they're getting ready for the party and insists that they have to cancel the party. They can't possibly have a party with a poor dead man just outside their house down the hill. His widow and his children, they might hear the party music, and it's too awful. But her sister, Josie, thinks that Laura's being ridiculous. She says, if you're going to stop a band playing every time someone has an accident, you'll lead a very strenuous life. And her mother refuses to cancel the party. She says, people like that don't expect sacrifices from us. It's not very sympathetic to spoil everybody's enjoyment. And Laura insists that this family, that they're nearly neighbors. But apparently they're not neighbors enough. The chasm is too big for the man's death to hinder the party. These chasms, the one in Jesus' parable, the one in Mansfield's story, they're obviously caused by money. The people who have a lot of it, the rich man and the Sheridans, they manage to isolate themselves from the people who don't have as much. The rich choose to live in their own gated world and spend their money on luxury items, on food that gets wasted. And these choices mean that they're cut off from friendship with the poor, from the web of community that could be theirs, from living in right relationship with their neighbors and with God. These are both, in their own ways, stories about the poverty of wealth. And certainly there are chasms today between the rich and the poor. The wealth gap, as you're probably aware, is obscene and it's growing. I imagine that in the Houston area right now, some of these gaps are becoming glaringly obvious in terms of people's ability to deal with the conditions that you're facing. We also need to talk about the racial chasm in our country, which of course is connected to the economic one, right? With this history going back to the genocide of indigenous people on this land and to chattel slavery. Still today, the racial wealth gap is overwhelming. On average, white households have 10 times the amount of wealth as black households. In addition to the wealth gap, there is also an experience gap, and that's something I've been thinking a lot about. This chasm that exists between the way I, as a white person, am able to be in and experience the world and the way that people of color experience the world. A few years ago, I remember I was driving in town and I changed lanes without signaling. And I had just heard Sandra Bland's mother on NPR talking about a settlement related to her daughter's death. And you might remember that Sandra Bland had been arrested in the course of a routine traffic stop and then later found dead in her cell. And I remembered, as I so casually changed lanes, that the violation she was pulled over for was failing to signal a lane change. That same week that Bland's settlement was in the news, so were the shooting deaths at the hands of police of Terrence Crutcher, whose van was broken down in the middle of the road, and Keith Scott, who was sitting in his car in the parking lot when he was shot. If my car broke down, I would be happy to see a police car pull up behind me. And I realized that this is not the experience of many black people in this country. I have read about young black men having panic attacks at the sight of police lights. When Keith Scott's wife, Rakea, saw the police officers approaching the car where her husband was sitting, she immediately yelled, "Don't shoot him. Don't shoot him." I have never in my life yelled, "Don't shoot." I've had some contact with police over the years. There was a rolling stop incident, and the time the police came to me with an inquiry about a criminal that I had talked to in a pastoral capacity, a couple of home visits by police when children had dialed 911 just, for fun. There were a few issues with one of my children leaving home, and a time when I turned in a large box of ammunition that we had inherited from my husband's father. At no point did it even cross my mind that I or anyone with me was in danger in these situations. Not when a police car pulled me over with their lights flashing, not when the police came knocking on my front door, asking what was going on with my kids, not when I carried a whole bunch of ammunition up to the police station. Never felt threatened, never felt unsafe. And that's not the experience of many, many people of color. That is an experience, a chasm in how we are able to experience the world. And of course, this police interaction is just one small part of the gap in my experience and the experiences of Black people in this country. The parable of the chasm. It is a great parable if you want to preach social justice, if you want to explore the inequities in society, to point out the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. But it's not such a great parable when you're looking for hope. Not so great when the huge inequalities, the deep divides, the chasms are already painfully clear. And what you want, what you need, is a word of grace and encouragement and hope that we might be able to go from here to there after all. That the unbridgeable chasm just might, by the grace of God, be bridgeable. But in the parable, it's not. Abraham is pretty adamant that the rich man cannot cross over to see Lazarus, and Lazarus can't cross over to him with a jug of water. So it's kind of a depressing parable. But I did notice that the chasm is not the only physical division in the parable. We also have the gate. We have a gate in the parable, and we have a gate in the garden party. Lazarus has been thrown at the rich man's gate. Laura laments that they can't possibly have a garden party with a man dead just outside the front gate. There is a great chasm, yes, but there are also gates. And the thing about gates, the beautiful, wonderful thing about gates, is that they can open. The parable, however slightly, hints at a better way. The rich man begs for Lazarus to be sent to his brothers and warn them. He wants Lazarus to tell them to open the gate and share with the people in need. Open the gate while there is a gate to open. Lazarus, of course, cannot warn them. These brothers have to listen to the prophets and figure out about the gate for themselves. And we have no idea if that happens. We don't know the story of the brothers. But Mansfield does tell us some of the story of the Sheridan sisters. After the garden party, Mrs. Sheridan has the brilliant idea to send the leftovers to the family of the man who has died. Laura's unsure of this plan, but she dutifully gets her basket and goes down the hill, out the gate, and to the home of the recent widow. Now, the thing about Laura is she's somewhat ridiculous. Early in the story, she fancies herself just like a worker because she spends about 5 minutes talking to the men who will put up the marquee. But she's quickly distracted from her reflections on the evils of class distinctions by the ringing telephone. And she's quite upset about the man's death, but her mother's able to distract her and get her to enjoy the party by giving her a nice hat to wear. The same hat she thinks she should have taken off before walking among the poor cottages. Laura's somewhat horrified to be ushered into the grimy little cottage where the widow lives. She wants to just set the basket down and run away, but she goes in and offers food and even looks at the dead man. Feeling like she should say something, she says, "Forgive my hat." That's how I feel sometimes, trying to go through the gate. When I think about trying to work for anti-racism, I'm afraid that I'll do it wrong because I will do it wrong. I'm afraid that I won't give enough, or I'll say something, I'll use the wrong words, people won't understand me, or I won't understand them. I'm afraid that I'll be in the way, or that I'll just feel ridiculous. And I'm afraid that sometimes I'm more concerned about feeling ridiculous than I am actually concerned about the people on the other side of the gate. When I read The Garden Party, I'm kind of embarrassed for Laura. Walking through the grimy streets past the little cottages with her basket full of leftovers and her fancy hat. But the thing is, at least she walked through the gate. The rich man didn't do it, and no one else in Laura's family did it. They all stayed in their comfortable homes with their nice clothes and their full tables. The rich man finds himself on the other side of the chasm with all hope of going through the gate lost. Laura's mom and her sisters still could decide to go through the gate, but there's most likely a great chasm in their future also. Those who don't go through the gate face the chasm, that hopeless division that separates us from each other and from God. So sure, Laura is ridiculous, but at least she's on the other side of the gate. So I have decided I don't like the title, The Parable of the Chasm, after all. I rather think of this as the parable of the gate. And I pray that we will have the vision to see the gates around us and the courage to walk through them, no matter how ridiculous we might feel.